It was almost the end of a story that has occupied the minds of marine historians for 80 years. The legend of Titanic started on Wednesday, April the 10th, 1912, when the new liner left White Star Dock in Southampton on her maiden voyage. She was to last only 5 more days. A souvenir edition of the periodical The Engineer was to describe her as practically unsinkable. But the press of the day left out the first word. Titanic, with her sister Olympic, had been designed as one of White Star Line's big 3 to compete with the Cunadas, Mauritania and Lusitania, already racing across the Atlantic at new record speeds. But they were to compete in luxury only, not speed. The White Star chairman, Bruce Ismay, planned unheard-of luxury at sea, yet retaining space for the emigrants hurrying to the shores of the New World. On board Titanic, with Ismay on this maiden voyage, the managing director of Harland & Wolff, her builders, Thomas Andrews. Also on board, in a more humble role, Frank Prentice, who worked in the purses department.
When we pulled away from Southampton Dock, there was the New York, the American line, about 10,000-ton ship, in front of us, moored in front of us. And as we pulled away, we pulled her with us. And I think they'd been together 2 or 3 days and got on well together, you see, and she wanted to come with us. But just before we sailed, I was looking out over the side and I saw there were 30-odd men dashing along to join her, which they should have been on board about 6:30 in the morning. It was 12 o'clock then. And the quartermaster wouldn't let them aboard. There were only one gangplank out then. We got all the others out. And they were probably very lucky not to join us. We left Southampton Water and went to Cherbourg. Picked up passengers there and mail. From there we went to Queenstown and picked up mail, specie, mail and passengers. Then we went flat out for New York.
There was an air of expectancy on board, as Frank Prentice could sense. After all, Titanic was nearly twice the size of her competitors.
It's a beautiful ship. And we had the cream of the White Star officials on board. We had Bruce Ismay aboard. We had the designer aboard. And we had 12 millionaires aboard and their wives. And, well, everybody was set to enjoy themselves. And after the third day, we had messages coming in about ice and icebergs, but we didn't seem to take much notice of that. We went flat out. And of course, on the night of the 14th, she hit a berg. If we hadn't hit that one, we'd have hit others, because we knew there was ice there. We had messages from all sorts of shipping.
Captain Titanic, westbound steamers report bergs, growlers and field ice in 42 north from 49 to 50 west.
From Masaba to Titanic, ice report in latitude 42 north to 4125 north, longitude 49 to 5030 west. Saw much heavy pack ice and a great number large icebergs, also field ice. Weather good, clear.
This last message from the Masaba never reached Captain Smith of the Titanic. Her radio operator was so busy that the message lay under a paperweight, forgotten by a man worn out by a backlog of passengers' radio traffic to transmit. Charles Lightoller was Titanic's second officer, who would have seen this message if it had reached the bridge. In 1936, perhaps with a degree of hindsight, he described what action he would have taken had the message arrived.
Those immense quantities of ice were abnormal for almost any time of the year, and the significance we should have attached to that report can hardly be exaggerated. In my opinion, it was a warning of the most vital importance. You see, I was officer of the watch and in charge of the ship when that Masaba message came over, and I know perfectly well what I should have done if it had come to my hands. Without a shadow of doubt, I should have slowed her down at once. That would have been imperative, and sent for the captain.
The greatest drama in maritime history was beginning to unfold. Edith Haisman was a 15-year-old girl travelling to New York with her parents.
It was getting colder, you know, you could tell there's icebergs then and that. And we had music that night. A band was playing. We went to bed about, say, 10:30. And all of a sudden, the ship sort of went into the iceberg. She sort of first going off, you know, because she was going full speed. And she was thrown back. And the second time, she did the same thing. And the third time, she stopped dead.
I was in my cabin then. We had a cabin for 6. And all of a sudden, she came to a halt. There was no impact as such. It was just like jamming your brakes on a car. And that was that. She stopped. We had a porthole open, and I looked out, and the sky was clear, the stars were shining, the sea was dead calm. And I thought, I don't know, I couldn't understand it. So I came out of my cabin, and I thought, well, I'd go forward. And I went forward to the well deck on the starboard side, and I could see ice in the well deck. There's no sign of iceberg then, because she'd passed us. And the lights were shining on the water from the portholes, and no sign of damage above waterline. And of course, what had happened, we'd slipped over the iceberg. And although she was supposed to be unsinkable with a double bottom, the iceberg had cut her from forward on the starboard side to the engine room, almost amidships, right through her 2 bottoms. And there was nothing could do about that because the bulkheads couldn't save her. I think if she'd smashed head on, we would have had a triple lot of damage. Probably a lot of people killed, but I don't think she would have gone down.
On the bridge of Titanic, decisions had to be made. Captain Smith realised that the situation was getting out of hand as water poured into the doomed ship.
Andrews and Bruce Ismay and the captain were together discussing this, and Bruce said to Andrews, how are things down below? And Andrews said, she's going to sink, sir.
So my father said, you go up on deck and see what's wrong. So he went up on deck and he came back. He says, you better get dressed and come up on deck. He says, they've only struck an iceberg, you see. So anyway, he heard some more news that we had to stay up on deck, and he put a life belt on my mother and I. And we waited there, and an officer come along and says, women and children first. And he said, all the boats start being put out.
Then things did begin to happen because the water was rushing in, and we had orders to get the lifeboats out. And because the same old order, women and children. And we swung the lifeboats out and gradually filled them up. First boats were away on the port side. And the first boats away didn't have many passengers on board because they were afraid to go down. There was a 70-foot drop to the water, and they didn't think she was going to sink. And a few of the first boats on the port side got away with half filled. Don't forget, we had 16 lifeboats, and they each carried 50. And if they'd been filled, we could have saved 800.
My father, he took my mother and I and put us into a lifeboat. Before that, while we were waiting for the lifeboat, my dad was standing there smoking a cigar, you know, and he says, oh, I'll see you in New York, you know. But my father went down with the Titanic, and my mother and I were rescued.
Then I had orders to go down the storeroom with a gang of men and get all the biscuits we could find and bring them up to the boats and distribute around the boats. Well, when we got back up onto the boat deck, we couldn't get near the lifeboats. They were all milling around there, and Some people were scrambling to get in and being pushed back. And then, by that time, she was listing very badly to port. And we couldn't get the starboard boats down. There were 3 boats. We got the first one down, but there were 3 boats up there that were full of passengers and mixture of crew, I suppose. And we couldn't get them down because she had sort of list to port. You can imagine halfway down, she would have hit the ship's side. Before I got my life belt on, I met a young couple. They'd spent their honeymoon in France, and we'd picked them up at Cherbourg. And she was having trouble with her life belt. So I fixed that on to her. And I said, I think you'd better get into a lifeboat. And there was one in the port, on the port side. So she said, no, I don't want to go there. I don't want to leave my husband. So I said, well, it's just precautionary measure. You get in, your husband will follow later on. And I got her away, and that was that. And then I picked up my own lifebelt and put it on. Then the third-class passengers were coming up. There were 700 of them. And they swarmed the decks and filled up the decks, and you couldn't get near the lifeboats then, and they were being pushed back from the lifeboats and all. And I thought, well, I'd done all I possibly could. I'd helped them all I could. And I thought, well, now I'll go up and get out of all this scrumming and go on the poop deck. There were about 4 of us up there. And whilst I was up there, we sent up these lights, rockets, which burst up very high in the sky, and then you could see our boats spread out all over the place. And I had that in mind somehow.
And this is where a mystery that has lasted for 80 years started. The distress signals put out by Titanic's radio operator had been answered by ships who were on their way to her position. The Cunarda Carpathia indeed ran at speeds that her captain never thought possible. But survivors have stated that there was another vessel much closer and visible from the sinking Titanic, who must have seen her distress rockets. Charles Lightoller was convinced of the identity of this ship.
That ship was the Californian, and though her lights were plain to everyone on board the Titanic, she seemed to pay not the slightest heed either to our wireless calls or to the distress signals we were firing every minute. The reason why she didn't answer our wireless calls, which other ships heard halfway around the Earth, was because she only carried one wireless operator. And when we struck the iceberg, he'd just gone off watch, so it was no fault of his. But why no notice was taken of our distress signals, shells that are fired hundreds of feet up into the air to explode with a cascade of stars, heaven only knows.
Eva Hart was also convinced that the ship was the Californian. At a formal inquiry later in the year, it was established that the Californian, stopped for the night in an ice field, had indeed seen rockets, but had not picked up Titanic's radio distress messages for the reasons that Charles Lightoller has mentioned. But Californian's master, Stanley Lord, always protested that his ship was over the horizon, well over 15 miles away. The inquiry found, however, that Californian could have reached Titanic if she'd made the attempt when she saw the first rocket. She made no such attempt. Captain Lord tried for years to clear his name, but died in 1962 with his reputation tarnished. However, in 1985, when Dr. Robert Ballard discovered the wreck of the Titanic at a different position to the one given in the distress calls by Titanic's radio operator, fresh impetus was given for reopening the inquiry into Californian's actions. As a result, a report's been published this month showing that Californian was probably between 17 and 20 miles from Titanic, but that proper action was not taken by Californian on sighting Titanic's distress signals. And it added that any reasonable action taken by Captain Lord wouldn't have led to a different outcome to the tragedy, as Californian would have arrived after Titanic had sunk. Captain Lord's son, also called Stanley, has fought for years to clear his father's reputation.
He knew quite well he could never have done anything. his conscience was clear, and I think that is why he didn't worry. He knew he couldn't have done anything, and most sensible people realized he couldn't either. But it's these people who seem to have their knife into the Californian for some reason. I don't know why.
So was Captain Lord made a scapegoat? Dr. Robert Ballard still feels, though, that having seen the rockets, the crew of the Californian should have taken some action.
My criticism is that there was enough activity to the south, with the flares being fired, the dialogue going on at the bridge, the fact that the watch sent messengers down to advise the captain that there was something peculiar going on, and all he had to do was one very simple thing. Say, have the radio operator turn on the radio and see what's going on. Because had he done that simple act, which certainly would not have placed his ship in jeopardy, he would have heard 50 ships responding to the SOS that the Titanic had sent out.
All this was to be in the future. The survivors, like Frank Prentice, Edith Haisman and Eva Hart, were abandoning ship as Titanic began to slide beneath the waves.
We were up on the poop deck, four of us, and she was sinking fast then. She'd righted herself. And Ricks went, and Kieran went. And I was there by myself then, thinking, and all of a sudden she lifted up quickly, and you could hear everything crashing through her. Everything that was movable was going through her. And then she went down and seemed to come up again. So I thought, well, now I'm going to leave. And I was hanging on to a board. We had two boards, starboard and port, which said, keep clear of propeller blades. And I was hanging on to one of these, and I was getting higher and higher in the air. And I thought, well, now I'll go. And I dropped in. I had a lifebelt on. And I hit the water with a terrific crack. And luckily, I didn't hit anything when I dropped in. And then I looked up at the Titanic. So the propellers were right out of water. The rudder was right out, and I could see the bottom. And then gradually she glided away, and that was that. That was the last of the Titanic.
You could hear the screams of the people on the ship, you know. It was really terrible. There was a lot of men on rafts and that, frozen, you know, some of them dead. It was very bad.
By the grace of God, I came across a lifeboat, and they pulled me in. And there was a fireman dead in the bottom, and there was about a foot of water in this boat. There was another man who he seemed to be trying to get away from it again. I don't know what was the matter with him. They were tying him down. And the rest were women and children. And I sat on a seat, and I sat next to Mrs. Clark, the girl I'd put into a lifeboat. I was in a pretty bad way then, as you can imagine. Frozen solid almost. And she wrapped me round with a cloak. She had some sort of blanket or a coat on. Anyway, I think she probably saved my life, I don't know. But I saved hers. At least I think I might have done. I think I did. And she saved mine.
Titanic's lifeboats had space for only 1,200 people. Only 706 were picked up by Carpathia, including the White Star chairman Bruce Ismay. In Southampton, the town was plunged into mourning. Every street in certain areas had lost crew members, over 500 in all. The tragedy was to have far-reaching effects. Never again would liners sail with too few lifeboats for the number of passengers. The watertight integrity of future liners was strengthened, and an iceberg patrol was immediately started so that adequate warnings were always available. And a 24-hour wireless watch was made compulsory on all ships at sea to listen for those warnings. So what has made the story of Titanic such an enduring one? Robert Ballard and Eva Hart have no doubts.
A variety of factors. The ship that couldn't sink, the wealth that was aboard, the influence and power that was aboard, the arrogance that was demonstrated, and Mother Nature coming in and reminding us of our mortality, reminding us that we're a very little thing in the big universe. The loss of innocent life, the stupidities, the the heroes, the cowards. It was a morality play acted out on the deck of that ship.
1,513 people died unnecessarily. They shouldn't have died. If there'd been enough lifeboats, they wouldn't have died. But all this vast tragedy and everything that happened about it makes me look upon it as a different sort of grave. And I entirely endorse what Dr. Ballard said. His actual words were, "It is quiet and peaceful, and a fitting place for the remains of this greatest of sea tragedies to rest. May it forever remain that way, and may God bless these found souls." And that's exactly how I feel about it.